My name is Garrett, and at 31 I never expected to be sitting across from my father at Thanksgiving dinner as he sneered, "You could have saved your sister." The accusation hung in the air like the scent of pumpkin pie between us. 10 years of blame since Ellie's accident, and nothing had changed. I calmly took another bite, stood up, and walked out. Before I tell you what happened when he called 2 weeks later begging for help, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and hit subscribe if you've ever had to cut toxic people out of your life. I grew up in a small town just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone, which sometimes felt comforting but mostly felt suffocating. My sister Ellie was born when I was 7, and from the moment my parents brought her home, I appointed myself as her personal protector. She had these big blue eyes that seemed to take in everything, and a laugh that could make even my father crack a smile on his worst days. Speaking of my father, Richard was not what you would call the nurturing type. He worked as a sales manager at a car dealership, and he brought that same aggressive energy home with him. Everything was a negotiation, a power play. When he was in a good mood, he could be charming and generous. But those moods were rare and unpredictable, like solar eclipses. My mother Diana tried her best to create stability in our home. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital, often taking night shifts so she could be home when we got back from school. I remember the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the determination. She wanted better for us than what she had. When I was 14, the arguments between my parents became impossible to ignore. They tried to keep their voices down, but in our small house, every harsh whisper carried through the vents. I would sit with Ellie in her room, reading her stories to drown out the sound of their fighting. She was only 7 then, too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, but old enough to sense that something was wrong. The divorce came as no surprise, but the custody arrangement did. My mother got primary custody of both of us, but my father had us every other weekend and one dinner a week. It seemed like too much time for someone who had shown so little interest in being a parent when we all lived together. After the divorce, my father's financial irresponsibility became even more apparent. Child support payments were consistently late. Sometimes they didn't come at all. He always had excuses. The dealership was having a slow month. His boss was holding back his commission. Unexpected expenses came up. My mother never complained to us about it, but I overheard her anxious phone calls to the bank, asking for extensions on bills. My mother fell into a depression after the divorce. She tried to hide it, but I noticed how she would stare blankly at the wall sometimes, how her smiles never quite reached her eyes anymore. With her working long hours and struggling emotionally, I stepped up to take care of Ellie. I became the one who made sure she did her homework, who packed her lunch, who walked her to and from the bus stop. I attended her parent-teacher conferences when my mother was working and my father simply didn't show up. I was a teenager raising a child while trying to navigate high school myself. Despite all of this, I managed to excel academically. School became my escape, the one place where I had control. I joined every academic club I could, partly because I loved learning and partly because it meant spending less time at home, where the weight of responsibility sometimes felt crushing. When I was accepted to MIT with a full scholarship during my senior year, it felt like validation for all the hard work, all the sacrifices. But that acceptance letter also presented a dilemma. Going to college meant leaving Ellie behind. She was 11 by then, still so young and vulnerable. Our father had become even more unreliable, sometimes canceling his weekends with us at the last minute because something more important came up. My mother was doing better emotionally, but was still working long hours to keep us afloat financially. I spent weeks agonizing over the decision. Ellie, with wisdom beyond her years, was the one who finally convinced me to go. "You have to," she said. "I will be okay." I made her promise to call me every day, and I arranged my class schedule so I could come home at least one weekend a month. I was 18 in my first semester at MIT when I got the call that would change our lives forever. I was in the middle of a physics lab when my phone rang. Seeing my mother's number, I stepped into the hallway to answer. "There's been an accident," she said, her voice breaking. "It's Ellie." I still remember the sound of my textbooks hitting the floor as I ran to my car. The 2-hour drive home was the longest of my life. Ellie had been riding her bike on a Saturday afternoon. It was my father's weekend with her, but he had gone to a bar to watch a football game with his friends, telling her to entertain herself for a few hours. She decided to ride to her friend's house a few blocks away. A distracted driver ran a stop sign and hit her at an intersection. When I arrived at the hospital, my mother was already there, still in her scrubs from her shift. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. My father arrived an hour later, reeking of beer and making a scene in the waiting room about how no one had called him sooner, though my mother had left him 6 messages. Ellie survived, but the injuries were severe. A traumatic brain injury, a shattered pelvis, multiple fractures in her right leg. The doctors were careful not to make promises about her recovery, using phrases like wait and see and extensive rehabilitation. What they did make clear was that her life would never be the same. I spent the next 2 weeks sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed, only leaving to shower at home when my mother came to relieve me. My professors were understanding, allowing me to submit assignments remotely. Ellie was in and out of consciousness those first days, and I wanted to be there every time she opened her eyes so she would know she wasn't alone. It was during one of these hospital vigils that my father first said the words that would echo through the next decade of our relationship. "This would not have happened if you had been here," he said, his voice low so the nurses wouldn't hear. "You were always better at watching her than I was. You know that. You should have stayed." I was too shocked to respond. My mother, who had just returned with coffees for both of us, was not. "How dare you?" she hissed. "Garrett is 18 years old. He is not responsible for your failures as a father. If anyone should have been watching her, it was you." My father stormed out, but the damage was done. A seed of doubt had been planted in my mind. What if he was right? What if I had prioritized my education over my sister's safety? What if my absence was the reason she was lying in that hospital bed, her future suddenly uncertain? The guilt took root, growing stronger with each passing day, despite my mother's and even Ellie's insistence that I had done nothing wrong. Once Ellie was stable enough to be transferred to a rehabilitation facility, I had to make another impossible choice: return to school or drop out to help with her care. My mother, despite her own exhaustion and worry, was adamant that I continue my education. "One of you needs to have the future you deserve," she said. "Ellie would never forgive herself if you gave up MIT because of her." So I returned to Cambridge, but nothing was the same. I called home multiple times a day. I spent every weekend I could at the rehabilitation center with Ellie. I watched her struggle through painful physical therapy sessions, saw her frustration as she had to relearn basic skills, held her hand when the reality of her new limitations would hit her and she would cry. My father's visits to the rehabilitation center were sporadic and brief. He would show up unannounced, make grand promises to Ellie about things he would buy her, or places they would go when she was better, then disappear again for weeks. Each time he would find a moment to remind me, in subtle and not so subtle ways, that I had failed my sister by not being there. A pattern began to establish itself. My father would call late at night, often after he had been drinking, to update me on some setback in Ellie's recovery, or to ask for money for some special treatment the insurance wouldn't cover. Each call would include a reminder of my supposed responsibility for her condition. And each time, despite recognizing the manipulation, I would send whatever I could, from my scholarship stipend or the money I made tutoring other students. I was determined to succeed, not just for myself now, but for Ellie. I needed to be able to help provide for her care, to ensure she had access to the best treatments and technologies available. This determination pushed me through sleepless nights of studying through the fog of depression that sometimes threatened to overwhelm me through the increasingly rare but still painful interactions with my father. 4 years passed in a blur of lectures, exams, hospital visits, and guilt. I graduated from MIT with honors, with my mother and Ellie in the audience. Ellie was in a wheelchair then, but she cheered louder than anyone when I walked across the stage. My father didn't attend, claiming he couldn't get the day off work, though I later learned he had gone on a fishing trip with friends that weekend. I accepted a position at a tech company in Boston, partly because the salary was excellent, but mostly because it meant I could be closer to Ellie. She was 18 by then, living with my mother and attending specialized classes at a local high school. The rehabilitation had helped her regain some functions, but she still struggled with coordination, processing speed, and short-term memory. The first apartment I rented was small but expensive, within walking distance of both my office and a train line that could take me directly to my mother's house. I lived frugally, saving as much as possible to contribute to Ellie's ongoing therapies and to start a fund for her future care. Despite the financial security of my new job, I was struggling emotionally. The guilt had become a constant companion, coloring every interaction, every decision. At the urging of a coworker who noticed my constant anxiety, I finally sought help from a therapist. Dr. Landry was a soft-spoken woman with keen eyes that seemed to see right through my carefully constructed facades. In our first session, she asked me to explain why I felt responsible for Ellie's accident. Because I wasn't there, I said, repeating the mantra that had played in my head for years. "And where should you have been?" she asked. "At home, watching out for her like I always did." "How old were you when the accident happened?" 8, Dan. "And Ellie?" 11. "And your father, how old was he?" The question caught me off guard. 43. So a 43-year-old adult was responsible for watching an 11-year-old child. But you believe it was the responsibility of an 18-year-old college student who was 2 hours away. When she put it like that, it sounded absurd. But years of my father's manipulation had warped my perception of the situation. It would take many more sessions before I could begin to unravel the knot of guilt and responsibility that had formed in my mind. Meanwhile, I continued to support Ellie financially and emotionally. I paid for specialized tutoring that helped her complete her high school education. I researched adaptive technologies that could help her live more independently. I spent my weekends with her, taking her to movies, museums, anywhere she wanted to go that was wheelchair accessible. My contact with my father became increasingly limited. He would still call occasionally, usually when he needed money, always with a subtle reminder of my debt to Ellie. I would send what he asked for, telling myself it was for Ellie's benefit, even as Dr. Landry gently suggested that I was enabling his manipulation. My mother remarried when I was 25. Stephen was a kind, steady man who worked as an architect and treated my mother with a respect and consideration my father never had. He was good to Ellie, too patient with her limitations and genuinely interested in her progress. For the first time in years, I felt like my mother and sister had the stability they deserved. With my mother and Ellie in good hands, I allowed myself to focus more on my own life. I was promoted at work, taking on a leadership role that came with more responsibilities, but also a significant salary increase. I made friends, dated occasionally, though I was always careful to explain my family situation early on. Some potential partners were understanding, others were not. I told myself I didn't have time for a serious relationship anyway. Over the years, Ellie's condition improved through intensive therapy. By the time she was 21, she had regained enough function to attend a community college program designed for students with cognitive disabilities. She moved into a supervised apartment complex where she could have independence while still having support available when needed. I visited her every Sunday, taking her grocery shopping and then cooking dinner together in her small kitchen. During these years, I maintained minimal contact with my father. He would call on holidays or when he needed money, which was increasingly often. He had lost his job at the car dealership and was working sporadically as a bartender. I would listen to his complaints about his financial situation, send what I could afford, and end the call as quickly as possible. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it was a life I had carefully constructed to balance my own needs with my sense of responsibility toward Ellie. I was building boundaries slowly but surely with the help of Dr. Landry. I was learning to recognize my father's manipulation tactics and to not immediately react to them. I was beginning to believe that I deserved happiness too. The November I turned 31. I received an unexpected call from my father. It had been almost 6 months since we last spoke, the longest period of silence between us since Ellie's accident. "Garrett," he said, his voice uncharacteristically warm. "I was hoping you might come to my place for Thanksgiving this year." I was so surprised that for a moment I couldn't respond. "I know we've had our differences," he continued, filling the silence. "But I'm trying to make some changes in my life. I want to reconnect with my kids. I miss you, son." The son threw me off. He rarely acknowledged our relationship in such explicit terms. Usually I was just the checkbook he could rely on in emergencies. "What about Ellie?" I asked. "Will she be there too?" There was a slight hesitation before he answered. I thought it might be good for just the two of us to talk first, man to man. Then maybe we could visit Ellie together sometime after. Something about the response felt off, but I was also intrigued by the possibility of my father finally taking responsibility for his actions for the years of blame and manipulation. "Let me think about it," I said, not wanting to commit immediately. Sure, he said, sounding disappointed but understanding. "Just let me know by next week so I can plan accordingly." After hanging up, I called Dr. Landry and scheduled an emergency session. We spent the hour discussing whether accepting the invitation was a good idea, and if I did go, how to set and maintain boundaries during the visit. "What do you hope might happen if you go?" she asked. I thought about it carefully. I guess I hope that he's genuinely changed, that he might apologize for blaming me all these years, that we might have some kind of relationship that isn't based on guilt and obligation. And what do you fear might happen? That it's just another manipulation, that he needs something from me, and this is his way of softening me up before asking. Dr. Landry nodded. Both possibilities exist. The question is whether you're in a strong enough place emotionally to handle it if your fear turns out to be correct. I believed I was. After years of therapy, I had developed tools to recognize and resist my father's manipulation tactics. I had learned to set boundaries and to not take responsibility for his emotions or actions. I felt ready to test these skills in a direct interaction. I called my mother next, seeking her perspective. She was cautious. "Your father has promised to change many times before," she reminded me. "But people can grow. Just be careful, honey. Don't let him pull you back into old patterns." Finally, I discussed it with my girlfriend Amanda. We had been dating for almost a year, and she knew about my complicated family dynamics. She was protective of me in a way no one had been before. "If you want to go, I support you," she said, "but remember that you don't owe him anything. If it gets uncomfortable, you can leave at any time." After considering all the advice, I decided to accept the invitation. I called my father back and told him I would come for Thanksgiving dinner. He seemed genuinely pleased, which fueled my cautious optimism about the visit. In the days leading up to Thanksgiving, I found myself both dreading and looking forward to the dinner. I purchased a bottle of expensive bourbon for my father and a pumpkin pie from a bakery he had always liked. I rehearsed potential conversations in my mind, preparing responses for various scenarios. The drive to my father's apartment on Thanksgiving Day was filled with anxiety. He had moved several times since the divorce, each new place smaller and less kept than the last. The current apartment was in a rundown complex on the outskirts of town. As I parked, I noticed the cracked pavement, the overflowing dumpsters, the general air of neglect that permeated the place. My father answered the door wearing a button-up shirt that had seen better days but was clearly an attempt to look presentable. The apartment behind him was surprisingly clean, though sparsely furnished. A small folding table had been set up in the living room area, covered with a paper tablecloth and set with mismatched dishes. "You made it," he said, stepping back to let me in. "I was beginning to think you might change your mind." I handed him the bourbon and pie, which he accepted with genuine appreciation. "Thanks, this is the good stuff," he said, examining the bourbon label. "And from Sullivan's Bakery, too." You remembered. The initial interaction was awkward but not unpleasant. We made small talk as he showed me around the tiny apartment. I noticed there were no personal photos displayed, no evidence of family or friends. The only decoration was a faded poster of a sports car on one wall. In the kitchen, a small turkey was roasting in the oven. Pots of instant mashed potatoes and canned cranberry sauce sat on the counter. It was a far cry from the elaborate Thanksgiving dinners my mother used to prepare, but it represented effort on my father's part, which I appreciated. "Nothing fancy," he said, noticing my gaze, "but it should be edible." "It looks great," I assured him. "Can I help with anything?" He shook his head. "Just keep me company. Tell me about your job. You're doing well for yourself from what I hear." As we waited for the turkey to finish cooking, I gave him a sanitized version of my professional life, careful not to mention my salary or savings. Years of experience had taught me that such information would inevitably lead to requests for money. He seemed genuinely interested, asking appropriate questions about my work and seeming impressed by my responses. It was the kind of conversation I had always wanted to have with my father, the kind I had imagined other sons had with their dads. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps he had changed after all. When the food was ready, we sat at the small table, the turkey and side dishes arranged between us. My father poured himself a generous glass of the bourbon I had brought and offered me one as well. I accepted a small amount, wanting to keep my wits about me. The conversation remained pleasant as we filled our plates. My father asked about my apartment, my friends, my hobbies. He told me about a new manager at the bar where he worked who was a real hard-ass but fair. It felt surreal, like we were actors playing the roles of a normal father and son catching up over a holiday meal. So he said, after a lull in the conversation, "How is your sister doing these days? I haven't seen her in a while." I was cautious but hopeful as I answered. "She's doing really well, actually. The new medication has helped with her seizures, and she hasn't had one in almost 6 months now. She's talking about maybe taking an art class at the community center next semester." My father nodded, seeming genuinely pleased. "That's good. She always liked drawing, even as a little kid." He took another drink of bourbon, longer this time. "I should visit her more often. It's just hard, you know, seeing her like that, remembering how she was before." I understood the sentiment. I had struggled with the same feelings in the early years after the accident, but I had never used them as an excuse to abandon her. "She would like to see you," I said carefully. "She asks about you sometimes." He nodded again, refilling his glass. "I'll make a point of it. Soon." The conversation shifted to lighter topics. He asked if I was dating anyone, and I told him about Amanda, how we had met at a charity event, how she worked as a pediatric nurse, how we were planning a trip to Maine in the spring. That's when I noticed the shift in his demeanor. A tightening around his eyes, a slight downturn of his mouth. He refilled his glass again, the third or fourth time I had lost count. "A vacation, huh?" he said, his tone changing subtly. "Must be nice to have the time and money for that." I recognized the warning signs, but chose to ignore them, not wanting to derail what had been a surprisingly pleasant dinner. "We've both been working hard. It will be good to get away for a few days." He snorted, a derisive sound I remembered well from my childhood. "Must be nice," he repeated, more edge to his voice now. "To be able to just take off whenever you want. To enjoy life without responsibilities weighing you down." I took a bite of turkey to avoid responding immediately, hoping the moment would pass. It didn't. "You know your sister doesn't get vacations," he continued. "She doesn't get to escape her reality. She's trapped in that broken body because of one afternoon when no one was watching out for her." And there it was. The real reason for the invitation, the true nature of our relationship revealed once again. Nothing had changed. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice even. "We've talked about this before. I was at college, 2 hours away. You were supposed to be watching her that weekend." His face darkened. "You were always better with her than me. You knew that. You could have come home more often. You could have stayed in the first place, gone to a local college, lived at home, been there when she needed you." I took a deep breath, thinking of all the tools Dr. Landry had given me for moments like this. The accident was a tragedy, but it wasn't my fault. I was 18 years old, starting my adult life. I couldn't have predicted what would happen. My father's hand tightened around his glass. "You always were selfish. Putting yourself first, your precious education, your fancy job, and now your vacations with your nurse girlfriend." He spat the word nurse like it tasted bad. "Meanwhile, your sister suffers every day because you weren't there when she needed you most." The familiar guilt threatened to rise up, but I pushed it back down. This time I saw the manipulation for what it was, a drowning man trying to pull me under with him. "You could have saved her," he sneered, leaning forward across the table. "If you had been home that weekend instead of off at your fancy school, she would be normal now. She would be whole." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and poisonous. In the past, I would have absorbed them, allowed them to feed the guilt I had carried for so long. I would have apologized, offered money, promised to do better somehow. But something had changed in me over the years. The guilt was still there. It might always be there, but it no longer controlled me. I calmly took another bite of pumpkin pie, chewed slowly, and swallowed. My father watched me, waiting for the reaction he expected, the one he had always been able to provoke. When none came, his face reddened further. "Did you hear what I said?" he demanded. "Your sister is the way she is because of you." I set down my fork, folded my napkin, and placed it beside my plate. "I heard you," I said, my voice steady. "It's the same thing you've been saying for 10 years. And it wasn't true then, and it isn't true now." I stood up, retrieving my coat from the back of the chair. My father's eyes widened in surprise, and then narrowed in anger. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice rising. "We're not done here." "I am," I replied simply. "Thank you for dinner." The turkey was good. As I moved toward the door, my father's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up abruptly. "So that's it. I tell you some hard truths, and you just walk out. Just like that." I turned to face him one more time. "They're not truths, Dad. They're manipulations. They always have been. I've spent years feeling guilty for something that wasn't my fault. I'm not doing it anymore." His face contorted with anger. "After everything I've done for you and your sister, this is how you repay me. By walking out on Thanksgiving." The absurdity of the statement almost made me laugh. Everything he had done. What exactly had that been? Years of missed child support payments. Sporadic visits to Ellie that left her more upset than comforted, constant emotional manipulation of both his children. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said, "Goodbye, Dad. Take care of yourself." The look of shock on his face, as I walked out the door and closed it firmly behind me, was something I would remember for a long time. The expected barrage of texts and calls didn't come as I drove home, the tension in my shoulders, gradually releasing with each mile that separated us. When I reached my apartment, I called Amanda, who had been on standby in case the dinner went poorly. I told her everything that had happened, including my calm exit. "I'm proud of you," she said. "That couldn't have been easy." It hadn't been, but it had been necessary. For the first time, I had refused to accept the burden of guilt my father had been trying to place on me for a decade. I had walked away from his manipulation instead of engaging with it. It felt like breaking the surface after being underwater for too long, finally able to take a full breath. The days following Thanksgiving passed with a strange new sense of lightness. I kept expecting to feel guilty about walking out on my father, kept waiting for the familiar weight to settle back onto my shoulders, but it never came. Instead, I felt something close to relief, maybe even freedom. I discussed the experience with Dr. Landry at our next session. She smiled when I described my calm exit from the apartment. "You set a boundary," she said. "A clear, firm boundary. That's significant progress, Garrett." I had to agree. For years, I had allowed my father to push my buttons, to manipulate me with guilt about Ellie. Walking away from his attempts to do so again felt like a breakthrough. The weekend after Thanksgiving, Amanda and I drove to her parents' house for a belated holiday dinner. Her family was warm and welcoming, the kind of people who hugged hello and goodbye, who laughed easily and often. Her father, a retired high school teacher, took genuine interest in my work. Her mother insisted on sending us home with enough leftovers to last a week. It was a glimpse into what family gatherings could be: joyful, supportive, uncomplicated. I visited Ellie at her apartment the following Sunday, as was our tradition. I had been worried that my interaction with our father might somehow affect her, that he might have called her with his version of events. But she was her usual cheerful self, excited to show me a painting she had been working on, a landscape of the park near her building. "It's beautiful," I told her, genuinely impressed by her progress. Her fine motor skills had been severely impacted by the accident, but years of occupational therapy had helped her regain enough dexterity to hold a paintbrush. The painting wasn't technically perfect, but it captured the essence of the place. The old oak tree, the winding path, the bench, where she liked to sit and feed the squirrels. "I'm thinking of entering it in the community art show," she said, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "Do you think it's good enough?" "Absolutely," I assured her. It's one of your best yet. We spent the afternoon cooking together a pasta recipe Amanda had shared with me. Ellie was getting more confident in the kitchen, another sign of her increasing independence. As we ate, she told me about a new friend she had made in her apartment complex, a young woman named Sarah, who also had a traumatic brain injury, though, from a car accident in her 20s. We go to the movies sometimes, Ellie said. Sarah knows all about the actors. She remembers everything. It's like having my own personal movie guide. I was happy for her, grateful that she had found friendship and community. For so long after the accident, she had been isolated, separated from her peers by her disabilities and by the long hospitalizations. Seeing her build a life for herself with meaningful relationships and activities eased some of the lingering guilt I still carried. 2 weeks passed without any contact from my father, the longest period of silence since the accident. No late-night phone calls, no texts asking for money just until payday. No guilt trips about not visiting Ellie often enough. The silence was a relief, though part of me wondered if he was all right. Then, on a Tuesday evening, as I was preparing dinner, my phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen. I considered not answering, but curiosity won out. I accepted the call but said nothing, waiting for him to speak first. Garrett. His voice was tight with stress. Are you there? I'm here, I confirmed, keeping my tone neutral. I need your help, he said, the words coming out in a rush. My rent check bounced. The landlord is threatening to evict me if I don't have the money by tomorrow. I don't get paid until next week. I leaned against the kitchen counter, absorbing the information. So that was why he had invited me for Thanksgiving. Not to reconnect, not to apologize, but to soften me up before asking for money. The realization should have hurt, but instead it just confirmed what I already knew about our relationship. How much I asked more out of curiosity than any intention to help. 800, he said quickly. I can pay you back next week when I get my check. I promise. It was more than he had ever asked for before, and the promised repayment was a familiar refrain that had never once been fulfilled in all the years I had been helping him financially. What happened? I asked. Why did the check bounce? There was a pause, then a sigh. I lost my job at the bar, about a month ago. The new manager I told you about, he caught me drinking during my shift. I've been trying to find something else, but you know how it is. The economy and all. The pieces fell into place. The Thanksgiving invitation, the attempt at reconciliation, all leading up to this moment of financial desperation. I've been doing odd jobs, you know, to make ends meet. He continued when I didn't immediately respond. But it's not enough. If I lose this apartment, I don't know where I'll go. I closed my eyes, thinking about all the times I had sent money, all the promises of repayment that never materialized, all the emergencies that seemed to occur with increasing frequency. What about Ellie? My father said, his voice taking on a desperate edge when I still didn't answer. If I'm homeless, how will I ever see her? You wouldn't want to be responsible for keeping a father from his daughter, would you? Especially after everything that's happened. And there it was again. The manipulation. The attempt to use Ellie and my guilt about her accident to get what he wanted. But this time I saw it clearly for what it was. This time, I was prepared. Dad, I said, my voice steady. I'm not going to send you money. There was a shocked silence on the other end of the line. What do you mean? Did you not hear what I said? I'll be evicted. I'll be on the street. I heard you, I replied. But I'm not going to continue enabling this cycle. You lost your job because you were drinking at work. That was your choice. Your rent check bounced because you mismanaged your money. That was your choice too. So you're just going to let me be homeless? His voice rose in disbelief and anger. Your own father. There are shelters, I said. There are programs that can help you find work and housing. I can give you information about those resources if you want. But I'm not giving you money anymore. The line went quiet for a moment, and I thought he might have hung up. Then his voice returned cold and hard. I see how it is. You've got your fancy job and your nurse girlfriend, and your perfect life. Meanwhile, your sister is disabled and your father is about to be homeless. But that doesn't matter to you, does it? As long as you're comfortable. In the past, these words would have cut deep, would have made me question my decision, would have eventually led to me sending the money just to ease the guilt. But not anymore. I'm sorry you're in this situation, I said. But I'm not responsible for it. And I'm not going to be manipulated by guilt anymore. Not about Ellie. Not about anything. You selfish bastard, he spat. After everything I've done for you. Goodbye, Dad, I said, and ended the call. Almost immediately, my phone began to ring again. I silenced it, then turned it off completely. I knew from experience that the calls and texts would continue escalating in desperation and anger until either I gave in or he found another source of money. But this time I wasn't going to give in. This time the cycle was going to end. After turning my phone back on the next morning, I found 17 missed calls and 23 text messages from my father ranging from pleading to threatening. I deleted them all without reading beyond the previews. It was harder than I expected, but I reminded myself that this was necessary for my own well-being. I called my mother later that day, wanting to give her a heads up that my father might try to contact her for money since I had refused. He already did, she confirmed. Called Stephen and me last night saying he was about to be evicted. Stephen told him we couldn't help, and he hung up on us. Did he try to use Ellie to guilt you too, I asked. My mother sighed. Of course. It's his go-to-manipulation tactic. Has been since the accident. We talked for a while about my decision to stop enabling my father's behavior. To my surprise, she was completely supportive. I should have encouraged you to set these boundaries years ago, she said. But I was worried about how it might affect you emotionally. You took on so much responsibility for Ellie after the accident. I didn't want to add to your burden by suggesting you also needed to manage your relationship with your father differently. She hesitated, then added, There's something you should know, Garrett. Some of the money you've been sending your father over the years, the money that was supposedly for special treatments for Ellie or for him to visit her, he's been using at least some of it for gambling. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Stephen saw him at a casino about 6 months ago when he was in that area for a work conference. Your father didn't see him, but Stephen watched him lose several $100s at a blackjack table in less than an hour. It was right after you had told me you sent him money for a new therapy program for Ellie. I felt a surge of anger, not just at my father for the deception, but at myself for being so easily manipulated for so long. I should have known. Don't blame yourself, my mother said firmly. Your father has always been skilled at manipulation, and you were trying to do the right thing for your sister. Your heart was in the right place. After the call with my mother, I made an appointment with a financial advisor. I had been directly supporting some of Ellie's therapies and activities for years, sending the money to my mother, who would then use it as needed. But if my father had been intercepting some of those funds, or manipulating me into sending money that never reached Ellie, I needed a better system. The financial advisor recommended setting up a special needs trust for Ellie. This would ensure that the money I contributed would only be used for her benefit and would be managed by a trustee, in this case my mother, who was legally obligated to act in Ellie's best interest. It would also protect Ellie's eligibility for government benefits, which could be jeopardized if she had too many assets in her own name. As I was finalizing the paperwork for the trust the following week, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would let unknown numbers go to voicemail, but something told me to answer this one. Is this Garrett Mitchell? A man's voice asked when I picked up. Yes, it is, I confirmed. Who's calling? My name is Carl Jenkins. I'm the property manager at Riverside Apartments. Your father, Richard Mitchell, listed you as an emergency contact and as someone who would cover any financial issues with his tenancy here. I closed my eyes, not surprised, but still disappointed. I see. And what is the issue, Mr. Jenkins? Well, his rent check bounced last week and he assured me that you would be covering it. But we haven't received any payment, and the eviction process will begin tomorrow if the balance isn't paid in full. I took a deep breath. Mr. Jenkins, I'm sorry my father told you that. But I never agreed to cover his rent. That's not my responsibility. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I see. Well, that puts us in an awkward position. Your father has been a problematic tenant for some time now. Late payments, noise complaints from neighbors, suspected drinking in common areas against building policy. The bounced check was the final straw. I felt a twinge of concern despite everything. As frustrated as I was with my father, I didn't want him to be homeless. Are there any resources you can connect him with, programs that might help him find alternative housing or financial assistance? Mr. Jenkins seemed surprised by the question. Actually, yes. The county has a prevention program for people facing eviction. They can sometimes provide emergency funds and connect people with other services they might need. I can give him that information. I would appreciate that, I said. And there's one more thing. I believe my father may have a drinking problem. If there are any resources for that as well, that information might be helpful. We talked for a few more minutes about the available programs. Before ending the call, Mr. Jenkins said, "You know, most family members in your position just pay the rent to avoid the hassle. It's refreshing to see someone taking a different approach." After the call, I sat at my desk thinking about my father's situation. I still cared about him despite everything. I didn't want him to suffer. But I also knew that continuing to bail him out financially would only perpetuate the cycle of dependency and manipulation. After consulting with Dr. Landry, I made a decision. I would offer to pay for 1 month of alcohol rehabilitation treatment for my father on the condition that he complete the program and agree to attend regular AA meetings afterward. It was a significant expense, but one that might actually help him, rather than enable his destructive behaviors. I called my father with the offer, half expecting him to reject it outright. He was silent for a long moment after I explained the conditions. "So you won't give me money for rent, but you'll pay for rehab." He finally said, his tone a mix of disbelief and resentment. "I don't have a drinking problem, Garrett. I have a money problem." "The drinking is why you lost your job," I pointed out, "which led to the money problem. This is the only help I'm offering, Dad. Take it or leave it." He hung up without answering. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. I had hoped that facing eviction might be the wake-up call he needed to accept help. 3 days later, as I was leaving work, my phone rang. It was my father again. "That rehab offer," he said without preamble. "Does it still stand?" I stopped walking, surprised by the question. "Yes, it does." "Fine," he said. The word coming out like it physically pained him to say it. "I'll do it. The landlord gave me a final extension because of some emergency housing program, but I still need a long-term solution, and no one will hire me. So I'll try the rehab." It wasn't the most enthusiastic acceptance, but it was a start. I made the arrangements that evening, finding a reputable 30-day inpatient program that had an opening the following week. I paid the fees up front, making it clear to the intake coordinator that this was a one-time payment and that any further treatment would need to be covered by my father or by his insurance if he qualified. My father entered the program with minimal protest, though he maintained that he was only doing it because he had no other options. I visited him once a week, our conversations awkward, but gradually becoming more honest. In his 3rd week, his counselor suggested a family therapy session, which I agreed to attend. Sitting across from my father in the sterile conference room of the rehabilitation center with a therapist named Marcus facilitating, I felt a complex mix of emotions: hope, skepticism, lingering anger, and a cautious desire for reconciliation. "Garrett," Marcus began, after introductions were complete, "your father has been doing some important work here, examining patterns in his life and how his choices have affected both himself and others. He has something he would like to say to you today." My father cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. He glanced down at a paper in his hands, which I assumed contained notes for whatever he wanted to say. "Garrett," he began, his voice rough, "the program here has made me look at some things I've been avoiding for a long time. One of those things is how I've treated you, especially since Ellie's accident." He paused, swallowing hard, before continuing. "I blamed you because it was easier than accepting my own responsibility. I was supposed to be watching her that day. I was her father, but I chose to go to a bar instead, and because of that choice, her life changed forever. I couldn't face that guilt, so I transferred it to you. I sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. In 10 years, this was the closest my father had ever come to acknowledging his role in what happened to Ellie. "I've used Ellie to manipulate you for years," he continued. "I've taken advantage of your love for her and your sense of responsibility. I've taken your money under false pretenses. I've made you feel guilty for living your life, and none of that was fair or right." He looked up from his paper, meeting my eyes directly. "You were a child. You couldn't have saved her. I was the adult, and I failed both of you. I'm sorry, Garrett. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am truly sorry." The words I had waited so long to hear washed over me like a wave. I had imagined this moment many times, had rehearsed what I might say in response. But now that it was happening, I found myself speechless. Marcus gently prompted me. "Garrett, would you like to respond to what your father has shared?" I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. "Thank you for saying that," I finally said. "I've carried the guilt of Ellie's accident for so long, believing that somehow I could have prevented it if I had made different choices. Hearing you acknowledge your responsibility, it means a lot." My father nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I can't change what happened," he said. "I can't undo the years of manipulation and blame, but I'm trying to be better now. This program, it's showing me how my drinking has been a way to avoid facing my failures as a father, as a man. I want to do better if you'll give me a chance." I didn't make any promises that day. The wounds were too deep, the trust too broken for immediate reconciliation. But it was a beginning, a first step toward a potentially healthier relationship. Over the following months, my father completed the rehabilitation program, and to my surprise continued with outpatient treatment and regular AA meetings. He found a job as a night janitor at a local office building. Humble work compared to his former career in sales, but steady employment that seemed to give him some stability. Our relationship remained cautious. We spoke on the phone every couple of weeks, saw each other for brief visits about once a month. There were still difficult moments, times when old patterns threatened to re-emerge. But there was also progress, small but significant steps toward a more honest connection. 6 months after that Thanksgiving dinner that had marked the beginning of this transformation, Amanda and I took Ellie to a local art exhibition where one of her paintings was being displayed. She was nervous but excited, eager to see her work hanging alongside other community artists. As we were admiring her painting a landscape that showed remarkable improvement in technique from her earlier works, a familiar voice spoke from behind us. "That's really good, Ellie. You've got a real talent there." We turned to see my father standing there, looking somewhat uncomfortable but making an effort. He had called earlier in the week asking if he could meet us at the exhibition. I had agreed, though, with some trepidation. Ellie's face lit up. "Dad, you came." She maneuvered her wheelchair toward him, and he bent down to give her an awkward hug. "Wouldn't miss it," he said. "My daughter, the artist." The four of us walked through the exhibition together, an unusual family group, Ellie, in her wheelchair, pointing out details in various artworks. My father sober for 6 months now, making an effort to engage and connect. Amanda supportive and observant, squeezing my hand occasionally in silent encouragement, and me still processing the changes in our family dynamic. Later, as Amanda and Ellie chatted with one of the other artists, my father pulled me aside. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I'm proud of you, Garrett. You've become a good man, a better man than I ever was. The way you take care of your sister, the way you've built a life for yourself despite everything. I'm proud to be your father, even if I haven't earned the right to claim that role." The words touched something deep inside me, a longing for paternal approval I hadn't even realized I still carried. "Thank you," I said simply. Our relationship was far from perfect. The years of manipulation and blame had left scars that would never completely fade. My father's recovery was still fresh, still fragile. There would be challenges ahead, setbacks, moments when trust would be tested. But standing in that art gallery, watching Ellie proudly show her painting to a small crowd of admirers with Amanda by my side and my father making a genuine effort to be present, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. That Thanksgiving, when I simply finished my pie and walked out, was a turning point. It wasn't just about standing up to my father's manipulation. It was about choosing to break a cycle that had been damaging all of us for too long. It was about setting boundaries that ultimately created space for healing to begin. If you've ever had to make the difficult choice to walk away from someone toxic even temporarily, I hope my story reminds you that sometimes that's the most loving thing you can do. Not just for yourself, but for them too. Have you ever had to set a difficult boundary with family? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about healing from family trauma. Thank you for listening. And remember, forgiveness doesn't always mean forgetting, but it can mean freedom.